Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a live-fire exercise for active duty personnel. The Seniors League meets on Tuesdays. The words, slick with a practiced condescension, slid from the lips of Sergeant Cross, the range master. They hung in the air, thick and oily, in the sterile, climate-controlled environment of the brand-new Marksmanship Assessment and Ranging System facility. A few of the younger soldiers, barely out of basic training and eager to align themselves with the man holding the clipboard, let out a few stifled snorts of laughter. The sound was sharp and cruel in the otherwise quiet space, a space that hummed with the low thrum of high-powered ventilation and the silent promise of violence. The crowd laughed, but the woman, the target of their collective amusement, did not. She offered no reaction at all. Her face, a roadmap of laugh lines around the eyes that spoke of a life lived, remained utterly placid. Her gaze didn't even flicker from the rifle she had been observing. The new M210 enhanced sniper rifle, a marvel of modern ballistics engineering resting in its cradle like a sleeping predator. She simply stood there, a study in stillness, a quiet island in a sea of youthful, uniformed arrogance. But when the general, watching from the glass-walled observation deck above, saw her stance, he saw something else entirely. He saw a ghost. If you believe true strength needs no announcement, type quiet professional below. The woman, who had signed a visitor log simply as Sarah Morgan, looked like anyone's aunt. She stood about 5'6", with a frame that was neither imposing nor frail, hidden beneath a pair of worn blue jeans and a simple gray t-shirt that had seen better days. Her hair, a mix of steel and silver, was pulled back in a severe, functional ponytail, revealing a face that was unadorned by makeup and etched with the fine lines of someone in their mid-40s. There was nothing about her that screamed operator. There was no hint of tactical gear, no high-speed watch, no subtle tattoo peeking from a sleeve. She was the definition of unremarkable, a person you would pass on the street without a second glance. And that, Sergeant Cross decided, was the problem. He was a man who believed in appearances. He believed in the crisp lines of a pressed uniform, the shine on a pair of boots, the loud, clear bark of an order. He saw the world in a clear hierarchy, and this woman, this civilian interloper, was not in it. She was an anomaly, a disruption to the clean, masculine order of his domain. He had been having a good day, demonstrating the M210's capabilities to a visiting dignitary, General Madsen, who observed with a quiet intensity from his perch. Cross felt the weight of that three-star gaze, and it made him preen, his voice growing louder, his gestures more expansive. He was the master of this theater, and he wanted the audience to know it. Then he saw her, standing off to the side, near the weapon cleaning station, just watching. She hadn't said a word, but her presence irked him. It was her focus. She wasn't looking around in awe like most civilian visitors. She was studying the rifle, her head tilted with an analytical stillness that felt less like curiosity and more like a critical assessment. It was this quiet judgment that pricked his ego, leading to his smug, dismissive comment. He expected a flustered response, an embarrassed apology, a hasty retreat. He got none of it. He got silence, a calm, unwavering silence that was somehow more challenging than any retort. He saw her hands, resting on the railing in front of her. They were not the soft, manicured hands he might have expected. The knuckles were slightly prominent, the skin calloused in patterns that spoke of long familiarity with metal and wood. Her posture, even at rest, was perfectly centered, her weight distributed with an unconscious economy of motion that was the hallmark of a lifelong athlete or something else. Cross, blinded by his own assumptions, saw none of this nuance. He saw only a middle-aged woman who was out of her depth. He decided to press his advantage, to make an example of her for the benefit of his young charges. Seriously, ma'am, he continued, his voice dripping with false concern, this equipment is highly sophisticated. It's not a .22 from the county fair. We wouldn't want you to get hurt. The snickering from the soldiers grew louder. Sarah Morgan finally turned her head, her eyes meeting his for the first time. They were a pale, clear gray, like a winter sky, and they held his gaze without a hint of intimidation. There was no anger, no fear, no embarrassment. There was only a calm, patient watchfulness, the look of a predator conserving its energy. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Understood, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was low and even, devoid of any discernible emotion. The simple, respectful reply should have diffused the situation, but to Cross, it felt like mockery. The lack of any emotional reaction was infuriating. It was like shouting at a rock. It made him feel small, and he hated it. He doubled down, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Look, I don't know who you are or what tour group you wandered away from, but my men are training for war here. We don't have time for distractions." He gestured vaguely at her, a gesture of dismissal. From his vantage point, General Madsen leaned forward, a deep frown creasing his brow. He had seen that stance before, decades ago, in a dusty, forgotten corner of the world. A young operator, impossibly still, impossibly calm, right before everything went to hell. He couldn't place the face, but the posture was a signature. It was a memory that made the back of his neck prickle. He watched as Cross, puffed up with his own petty authority, continued his one-sided assault. The sergeant felt he was on a roll, the silent approval of his audience fueling his arrogance. "You know what?" he said with a theatrical sigh, a smirk playing on his lips. "Since you're so interested in the M210, why don't you show us how it's done? Come on, give it a try. Don't be shy." He swept his arm towards the firing lane with a flourish. It was a classic bully's gambit, a public, impossible challenge designed to ensure maximum humiliation. The rifle was zeroed for a shooter of his size and build, the advanced optics were calibrated for a trained eye, and the target simulation he had in mind was one that had humbled even his most experienced snipers. He was setting a trap, and he was sure she was about to walk right into it. He expected her to stammer, to refuse, to finally show the weakness he was so certain was there. Instead, the woman, Sarah Morgan, simply said, "Yes, Sergeant," 2 words. "No hesitation, no emotion." She pushed herself off the railing and began to walk towards the firing lane. Each step was measured, deliberate. The quiet confidence in her movement sent the first, tiny sliver of doubt into Cross's mind, but he quickly pushed it away. This would be even better than he imagined. The entire room was now watching, a palpable tension replacing the earlier amusement. The young soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. This was escalating beyond a simple joke. They were about to witness a ritualistic humbling, and some of them, for the first time, began to feel a knot of discomfort in their stomachs. The woman's calm was unnerving. It wasn't the false bravado of someone trying to save face. It was a profound and unsettling stillness, a peace that seemed to emanate from her very core. She walked past Sergeant Cross without a glance, her focus entirely on the rifle waiting for her at the firing station. She was no longer just an observer. She was a participant, and the rules of the game, though no one else knew it yet, were about to fundamentally change. Her approach to the weapon was a silent masterclass in professionalism. She didn't grab it or handle it with the casual familiarity of a common soldier. She approached the bench with a kind of reverence, her movements fluid and economical. Sergeant Cross stood behind her, arms crossed, a smug grin plastered on his face, ready to offer a stream of condescending advice. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. He was captivated, against his will, by the sheer efficiency of her actions. Her hands, those calloused, steady hands, moved over the M210 with a surgeon's precision. She didn't need to hunt for the controls. Her fingers knew them intimately. She checked the chamber with a practiced flick of the bolt, the motion so smooth and quiet it barely registered. She ran a thumb along the seam of the magazine, verifying the seating of the rounds by feel alone. She settled onto the stool, but instead of immediately shouldering the rifle, she took a moment. She closed her eyes, just for a second. It was a moment of centering, a quiet gathering of focus that was so intensely personal it felt like an intrusion to watch. When she opened them again, they were different. The calm, patient watchfulness was gone, replaced by a sharpened, diamond-hard clarity. She was no longer Sarah Morgan, the unassuming civilian. She was someone else entirely. Cross watched, his smirk faltering as she adjusted the rifle stock. A single, precise click. She didn't need to fiddle with it. She knew her exact length of pull. She brought the rifle to her shoulder, and it was not so much an action as a union. The weapon became an extension of her body, settling into place as if it had been custom molded for her. Her cheek found the stock, creating a perfect, repeatable weld. It was a flawless execution of fundamentals, the kind of thing Cross preached to his students every day but had rarely seen performed with such unconscious grace. He felt a growing unease. This was not the fumbling of a novice. This was the practiced ritual of a master. "All right," Cross said, his voice a little tighter than he intended. "The system is programmed for the advanced qualification course. Multiple targets, unknown distances, variable wind conditions. The system will feed you the data, but it's up to you to make the adjustments. Not that you'll know what to do with them." He couldn't help but add the last little barb, a desperate attempt to reclaim his authority. Sarah said nothing. Her left eye closed, her right eye looked through the scope. On the massive screen at the end of the 100-meter range, the simulation flickered to life. A photorealistic desert landscape appeared, complete with shimmering heat haze and a digital wind indicator that was already gusting unpredictably. Suddenly, an alarm klaxoned through the facility, a piercing, insistent sound that made everyone jump. Red lights began to flash on the walls. On the main monitor, the qualification program vanished, replaced by bold, block letters. System-wide priority drill initiated. Scenario: Cobalt Serpent. Unauthorized access locked. Cross swore under his breath. Cobalt Serpent. It was the ultimate stress test for the entire base's command and control network, and it always included a live-fire component so complex, so utterly unforgiving, that it was considered unwinnable. It was a chaos simulation, designed to push operators to their absolute breaking point and beyond. No one, not in any branch, had ever cleared the Cobalt Serpent sniper module. The parameters were legendary. 10 targets, appearing in a randomized, unpredictable sequence at ranges varying from 300 to 1,500 meters. Some were moving, some were partially obscured, and the environmental data fed to the shooter was intentionally corrupted, forcing them to rely on instinct and manual calculation. To make it worse, the final target was a high-value principal surrounded by no-shoot hostage targets, with a firing window of less than 2 seconds. It was a nightmare. "Drill's hot," Cross yelled, more to himself than to anyone else. "Well, ma'am, looks like you picked the wrong day to play soldier." He reached for the console to abort the run for the civilian shooter, but a calm voice stopped him. "Leave it." It was General Madsen, his voice coming through the range's intercom system, sharp and authoritative. "Let her run it." Cross froze, his hand hovering over the button. He glanced up at the observation deck. Madsen was standing now, his face pressed against the glass, his expression unreadable. An order was an order. Cross backed away from the console, a feeling of cold dread mixing with a morbid curiosity. He looked back at the woman at the firing lane. She hadn't flinched at the alarms. She hadn't reacted to the change in scenario. Her breathing was slow and even, her body perfectly still. She was the calm at the center of the storm. The simulation began. The first target, a digital silhouette of an enemy combatant, appeared on a distant ridge, 850 meters out. The wind was gusting left to right at 15 miles per hour. A difficult shot, but manageable for a skilled sniper. Cross watched, expecting her to take her time, to calculate, to breathe. She did none of those things. Or rather, she did them all in a span of time too short to measure. There was a single, controlled exhale, and then the crack of the rifle, sharp and definitive. Before the sound had even finished echoing through the range, a red digital mist erupted from the target on the screen. A perfect center mass hit. The soldiers behind her gasped collectively. Cross's jaw went slack. She hadn't even seemed to aim. The bolt of the M210 slid back and forward in a single, fluid motion, the empty casing ejecting in a graceful arc. Her eye never left the scope. A second target appeared, this one a moving vehicle at 1,100 meters. The shot required leading the target, calculating its speed, the bullet's travel time, the wind's effect. It was a complex ballistic problem that should have taken several seconds to solve. The rifle cracked again. Another perfect hit, the bullet striking the virtual driver through the windshield. Then a third target, a fourth. Each shot was an impossibility. She was firing with the speed and rhythm of a semi-automatic carbine. Yet each round was a pinpoint of lethal precision at extreme range. She wasn't just shooting. She was conducting a symphony of violence. The digital range data flashed on the screen beside her. Wind speed, humidity, barometric pressure, even the Coriolis effect for the longest shots, but she seemed to ignore it. She was reading the environment with an instinct that transcended technology, seeing the invisible currents of the air, feeling the subtle pull of the Earth's rotation. She was one with the weapon, the environment, the physics of the bullet. The ninth target was the one that broke Cross's brain. Two hostiles, running perpendicular to each other, were programmed to cross paths for a mere 7 seconds at 1,300 meters. The legendary thread the needle shot. It was a theoretical shot designed to be impossible, a way to guarantee failure in the simulation. As the two figures converged, she fired. The single round passed through the head of the first target and the chest of the second at the exact instant they overlapped. A single shot, 2 kills. The program itself seemed to stutter, unable to process what had just happened. The range was now utterly, profoundly silent, save for the hum of the machines and the sound of Sarah Morgan's rhythmic breathing. The young soldiers were no longer standing. Some were leaning against the walls for support, their faces pale with shock and awe. Sergeant Cross was frozen in place, his mouth hanging open, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the unassuming middle-aged woman with the God of War performance he was witnessing. Everything he thought he knew about skill, about experience, about the limits of human potential was being systematically dismantled before his very eyes. And then, the final target appeared. The hostage scenario. The high-value target, partially obscured by a cowering civilian figure. The firing window was a sliver of space, barely the width of a human head, and it would only be clear for a moment. This was the true test, the moment that separated the great from the legendary. The entire room held its breath. The silence was absolute, a crushing weight of anticipation. It was more than just a drill now. It was a moment of revelation. The rhythmic crack of the rifle was replaced by an unnerving stillness. Sarah did not fire. She waited. The timer on the screen ticked down 3 seconds. The target moved, the opening appearing for a fraction of a second. Still, she waited. Cross wanted to scream. Shoot. 1 second. The timer hit 0. The target disappeared. A message flashed on the screen. Firing window closed. Target escaped. A collective sigh of disappointment, mixed with confusion, rippled through the onlookers. She had failed. After all that, she had hesitated. Cross felt a bizarre mixture of relief and bewilderment. He took a half step forward, ready to say something, anything to break the spell. But then, a new message appeared on the screen. Analyzing shot trajectory. The rifle hadn't fired. What trajectory? The simulation replayed the final seconds, but in slow motion. It showed the high-value target, the hostage, and it highlighted something no one had seen in real time. For a single frame, a gust of virtual wind, a random variable programmed into the simulation, had pushed the hostage's head a single inch into the bullet's path. The perfect shot would have killed the hostage. The system, in its cold, binary logic, declared her decision not to shoot as the only correct tactical choice. A new score flashed on the screen. It wasn't a number. It was a single word, one that had never before been displayed at the conclusion of the Cobalt Serpent module. Perfect. The word hung in the air, a testament not just to impossible marksmanship, but to impossible judgment. The deafening silence that followed was of a different quality now. It was no longer the silence of shock, but the silence of reverence. It was the sound of myths being born. Sergeant Cross stared at the screen, then at the woman who was now calmly clearing the rifle, her movements just as precise and unhurried as before. The arrogance had been sandblasted out of him, leaving behind a hollowed-out cavern of pure, unadulterated awe. He finally managed to find his voice, a choked, broken whisper that was barely audible. Who are you? His question was answered not by her, but by the sound of heavy boots on the concrete floor behind him. The door to the observation deck had opened, and General Madsen was walking onto the range. His face was grim, his eyes fixed on Sarah Morgan. He walked with a purpose that silenced the room more effectively than any command. As he approached, a high-priority alert chime from the Rangemaster's main console, the one Cross had abandoned. It was a sound he had never heard before, a tone reserved for the highest levels of command override. Every soldier in the room, including Cross, instinctively snapped to attention as the general passed. But Madsen didn't seem to notice. His focus was singular. He stopped directly in front of the console, his eyes scanning the screen. Cross, standing at a rigid parade rest, risked a sideways glance. The screen, which should have been displaying the drills after-action report, was now a stark black, with a single line of text blinking in blood red at the center. It required Madsen's own retinal scan and command codes to unlock. The general leaned in. The system verified his identity, and a new screen appeared. It wasn't a report. It was a directive. A single line of text that made Sergeant Cross's blood turn to ice water. Call sign, Widow Mark, reactivated. Auth, Joint Chiefs of Staff. Priority, Zeus. Cross felt his knees weaken. Widow Mark. It wasn't a real call sign. It couldn't be. It was a ghost story a boogeyman whispered about in classified briefings and late-night sessions at the NCO Club. A legend from the shadowy days of the early global war on terror. A sniper so effective, so phantom-like, that enemy commanders had put a multi-million-dollar bounty on a ghost they could neither name nor find. The story said Widow Mark was responsible for single-handedly turning the tide in a dozen secret battles. A force of nature who could appear, eliminate a target of strategic importance from an impossible distance, and vanish without a trace. They said the call sign was retired after a mission so sensitive, so deeply classified, that all records of its existence were purged. It had become a myth, a cautionary tale about the kind of quiet, unseen lethality that truly shaped the world. Cross looked from the terrifying words on the screen to the woman in jeans and a t-shirt who was now wiping down the M210 with a solvent-soaked patch. The disconnect was so profound, so jarring, that his mind refused to accept it. It was impossible. It was a coincidence, a glitch in the system. But then General Madsen turned away from the console and faced the room. His expression was one of profound gravity. He looked at the stunned faces of the young soldiers. Then his gaze settled on Sergeant Cross, and his eyes were as hard as granite. "Sergeant," Madsen began, his voice low but carrying an authority that vibrated in the very air. "For the past hour, you have been a disgrace to your uniform. You have used your rank not to lead, but to belittle. You have allowed your assumptions to blind you to the reality standing right in front of you." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Cross felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "You stand in the presence of a living legend," Madsen continued, his voice resonating with a mix of anger and reverence. "And you treated her with all the respect of a drill sergeant hazing a new recruit. You asked her who she is. Allow me to educate you." He took a step towards Sarah Morgan, who had finished cleaning the rifle and was now simply standing, watching him with that same unnerving calm. "This," the general said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is Master Gunnery Sergeant Sarah Morgan. Retired." He let the rank hang in the air for a moment. Master Gunnery Sergeant. A rank of immense respect, earned over decades of superlative service. But he wasn't finished. Her call sign, the one some of you may have heard stories about, is Widow Mark. And those stories, gentlemen, do not even begin to do her justice. A wave of shock rippled through the young soldiers. They exchanged wide-eyed glances, the legendary name confirming their wildest, most unbelievable suspicions. "She isn't just a visitor here, Sergeant Cross," Madsen said, his gaze boring into the younger man. "She is the architect. This entire Mars facility, the advanced holographic targeting, the variable environmental simulators, she was the lead consultant on the design team. The unwinnable Cobalt Serpent scenario you just witnessed? She wrote the code. It wasn't a simulation of a difficult mission. It was a memory. The revelation landed like a physical blow. She hadn't just beaten the system. She had beaten her own ghost." Madsen wasn't done. He felt a duty to burn this lesson into the soul of every person in the room. "You questioned her familiarity with the M210. Master Gunnery Sergeant Morgan was the lead operational tester for the entire program. She has more trigger time on that weapon platform than every man in this room combined. She didn't just learn to shoot it. She taught the engineers how to build it. Every ergonomic curve, every half-pound of weight reduction, every modification to the optics, it bears her invisible signature, He gestured to the rifle, now gleaming under the overhead lights. That weapon is her legacy in steel and carbon fiber. The general took a deep breath, his chest swelling. He turned to face Sarah Morgan directly. He looked at this woman, who appeared so ordinary, and saw the decades of sacrifice, the immense burden of a skill so profound it had isolated her from a normal life. He saw the quiet, uncomplaining competence that had saved countless lives and shaped the course of history from the shadows. In that moment, he was not a three-star general addressing a retired NCO. He was simply a soldier in the presence of greatness. With a movement as sharp and precise as one of her shots, General Madsen brought his hand up in a perfect, formal salute. He held it, his arm ramrod straight, his eyes locked on hers. It was a gesture of the deepest possible respect, a public acknowledgement that transcended rank and protocol. It was a king bowing to a champion. The silence in the room was now absolute, filled with the unspoken weight of this extraordinary moment. Every soldier, seeing their general's action, followed suit, their arms snapping up in a unified salute. Sergeant Cross, his face a mask of shame and awe, rendered the sharpest salute of his life, his eyes stinging with tears he refused to let fall. Sarah Morgan looked at the sea of saluting men, at the general holding his salute with unwavering respect. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The salute was not for her, not really. It was for the idea she represented, the quiet professional, the silent warrior whose worth was measured not in words, but in deeds. The legend of what happened that day spread through the base like a shockwave. It didn't travel through official channels or after-action reports, but through the hushed, excited whispers of the soldiers who had been there. It became the day Widow Mark came back. The story flew through encrypted text messages from this base to others across the globe. Operators in dusty forward operating bases and analysts in sterile intelligence centers would read the messages, and a slow grin would spread across their faces. The myth was real. The tale was told in the mess hall over lukewarm coffee and dry eggs. It was recounted in the barracks late at night, the young soldiers speaking in tones usually reserved for religious texts. The details, as they always do, began to shift and embellish with each telling. In some versions, she had shot the wings off a fly at 2,000 meters. In others, she had reprogrammed the simulation with her mind. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained unchanged. An arrogant gatekeeper had been humbled by a quiet master, and competence had triumphed over assumption. The story became a parable, a powerful lesson in humility. The impact on Sergeant Cross was profound and immediate. General Madsen gave him a formal, written reprimand that was placed in his permanent file, a black mark that would likely halt any further career progression. But that was the least of his punishments. His true penance was the memory of his own foolishness, the burning shame of his public display of ignorance. His authority on the range was gone, not because it had been officially stripped, but because it had evaporated in the face of true mastery. He could no longer command respect through volume and sarcasm. He would have to earn it through knowledge and humility, a currency he was only just beginning to understand. A few days later, he saw her again. She was in a small instructional classroom, quietly talking with the same group of young soldiers who had witnessed his humiliation. There was no bravado, no war stories. She was demonstrating breathing techniques, using a simple wooden dowel to illustrate the principles of a stable shooting platform. She was teaching. Cross stood in the doorway for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what he had to do. He walked into the room, and the quiet conversation stopped. The young soldiers looked at him, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. Sarah Morgan turned to face him, her gray eyes as calm and unreadable as ever. "Ma'am," Cross began, his voice cracking. He had to clear his throat and start again. "Master Gunnery, Sergeant Morgan, I wanted to apologize. My behavior was unprofessional and inexcusable. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I am truly, deeply sorry." He stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, bracing for a lecture, a dismissal, anything. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her gaze analytical. Then she gave that same small, deliberate nod. Apology accepted, Sergeant, she said simply. Then she added, her voice soft but firm. Assumptions are a liability. In our line of work, they get people killed. You judge the shot, not the shooter. You judge the action, not the actor. Remember that it was not a rebuke, but a piece of professional advice delivered without malice. It was the most valuable lesson he had ever received. He stammered his thanks and backed out of the room, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted. He had not been forgiven, perhaps, but he had been heard. He had been given a chance to learn. The legacy of that day began to solidify in more tangible ways. General Madsen, a man who understood the power of symbols, ordered the final target from the Cobalt Serpent simulation to be preserved. Not the digital file, but the actual physical backstop from Lane 4. Technicians carefully cut out the section of ballistic gel and steel plating. There in the very center of the silhouette's head was a single, perfectly round hole. Madsen had it mounted in a heavy glass and mahogany case and placed it at the entrance to the main training facility, right where every student would see it every single day. The brass plaque beneath it was simple, engraved with the words Sarah Morgan had spoken to Sergeant Cross. Assumptions are a liability. There was no name, no date. There didn't need to be. Everyone knew what it meant. And the firing lane she had used, Lane 4, was unofficially but permanently renamed. The soldiers called it the Widow's Perch. To be assigned to shoot from that lane was considered both an honor and a heavy responsibility. It was a silent reminder that the standard for excellence was not just high. It was perfect, and it was quiet. The change rippled outwards, affecting the very culture of the institution. The swagger and loud boasting that had once been common among the instructors began to fade, replaced by a more sober, focused professionalism. The value of quiet competence, of letting your skills speak for itself, became the new, unwritten code. The young soldiers who had witnessed the event were transformed. They had seen something holy, a glimpse of the ideal they were all striving for. They trained harder, with a newfound sense of purpose and humility. They had learned the most important lesson of their careers before they had even begun. The most dangerous person in the room is rarely the one who makes the most noise. The story of that day became a foundational myth, a piece of institutional folklore passed down from one generation of snipers to the next. It was a living lesson, more powerful than any training manual or classroom lecture. It taught them that respect is earned through demonstration, not demanded through rank. It taught them that true strength is quiet, that true confidence is calm. Sarah Morgan herself was gone within a week. Her reactivation had been for a specific, highly classified consultation regarding an emerging threat. She had provided her analysis, updated the threat simulation parameters based on new intelligence, and then, as quietly as she had arrived, she disappeared back into the anonymous fabric of civilian life. She left no forwarding address, no contact information. She simply vanished, leaving behind only an echo, the echo of a single, perfect shot and the enduring legacy of standard that could never be met, only strived for. Months later, a new class of sniper candidates assembled on the range for their first day of advanced training. They were young, confident, the best shots from their respective units. They stood in a loose formation, their chests puffed out, a familiar arrogance in their eyes. Sergeant Cross stood before them. He was a different man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity. His voice was softer, but his words carried more weight. He didn't start with a lecture on ballistics or wind reading. He started by walking them over to the glass case at the entrance of the building. He tapped the glass, drawing their attention to the single, perfect bullet hole. "Before we fire a single round," he said, his voice low and steady, "you need to learn the most important lesson you will ever learn in this place. You need to learn about assumptions." He then told them the story. He didn't spare himself. He recounted his own smugness, his own ignorance, his own public humbling, in detail. He told them about the unassuming woman, the impossible simulation, and the 3-star general salute. He told them what she had said to him. Judge the action, not the actor. When he was finished, a profound silence settled over the new recruits. The arrogance had been wiped from their faces, replaced by a look of sober reflection. They looked at the bullet hole in the case, then at each other, a new understanding dawning in their eyes. The person who fired that shot, Cross concluded, never spoke a word about her accomplishments. She never had to. Her competence spoke for her. That is the standard in this room. That is the standard of a true professional. Your rifle will speak for you. Make sure it tells the right story. He saw the lesson land. He saw the shift in their posture, the new focus in their eyes. He had taken his own greatest failure and forged it into his most effective teaching tool. The legacy of Widow Mark was not just in the records of her classified missions, but in the changed heart of a once arrogant NCO, and in the minds of the next generation of warriors he was now truly qualified to lead. True strength, true legacy, is not a monument you build to yourself. It is not a name carved in stone or a list of medals pinned to a chest. It is a quiet, invisible force that changes the people around you for the better. It's the standard you set, the example you live, the knowledge you pass on. It is the ripple effect of a single, perfect action, spreading outwards through time, long after the actor has left the stage. Sarah Morgan, wherever she was, would never know the full impact she'd had that day. She wouldn't want to. For the quiet professional, the work is its own reward. The legacy is not what you leave behind in your name, but what continues forward in the actions of others. It is the echo of a lesson learned, a standard raised, a competence that inspires. It is the deafening silence that follows a moment of undeniable truth. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption and where silent precision defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.